In the year 2147, humanity had reached heights that once seemed impossible. People lived on planets far beyond Earth, and spaceships traveled between stars as if they were crossing oceans. Yet, even with all this progress, there were still mysteries, waiting to be uncovered. One such mystery lay hidden on a distant planet called Kepler 62F, a world covered in lush forests and teeming with life forms unlike anything seen before. Dr. Alan Carter was no stranger to adventure. As one of Earth's top anthropologists, he spent most of his life studying ancient civilizations and forgotten cultures. His latest mission brought him to Kepler 62F, where reports suggested primitive life might exist. Accompanying him were two others, Laura Bennett, a linguist who specialized in decoding unknown languages, and Jake Miller, a survival expert trained to handle dangerous situations. Together, they formed a team ready to explore the unknown. The air on Kepler 62F felt different from Earth's. It was thick and carried a faintly sweet smell, like flowers blooming after rain. The sky glowed orange, casting long shadows across the ground. Towering trees stretched high into the heavens, their trunks wide enough for 3 people to stand around comfortably. Strange bird-like creatures flitted between branches, chirping melodies unfamiliar yet strangely soothing. As the team ventured deeper into the forest, they marveled at how similar this place seemed to Earth during its early days. The plants looked prehistoric, with massive ferns and moss-covered rocks scattered everywhere. Streams bubbled gently nearby, reflecting the golden sunlight filtering through the canopy above. For a moment, it felt peaceful, almost serene. But then something caught Alan's eye. He stopped suddenly, causing Laura and Jake to glance back at him curiously. "Look over there," he whispered, pointing toward a clearing ahead. Through the dense foliage, they could see movement, shapes darting between the trees. At first glance, they appeared human-like but slightly different, with broader shoulders and longer limbs. Their skin had a grayish tint, and their eyes reflected light in an eerie way. Laura gasped softly while Jake instinctively reached for the weapon strapped to his side. "Stay calm," Alan said firmly, though his own heart raced. He stepped forward cautiously, signaling for the others to follow. They moved quietly, careful not to make noise that might startle whatever, or whoever, they were observing. When they finally reached the edge of the clearing, they froze in awe. Before them stood a group of humanoid beings huddled around a small fire. They wore clothes made of animal hides and carried tools crafted from stone and bone. Some were sharpening weapons, while others tended to what looked like freshly caught prey roasting over the flames. There was a sense of order and purpose in their actions, as if each member knew exactly what role they played. Jake frowned, scanning the area for potential threats. "These guys don't look so primitive," he muttered under his breath. Alan nodded slowly, his mind racing with possibilities. "They're using tools and working together," he replied. "This isn't just random behavior, it's organized." Laura crouched beside him, her notebook already open as she scribbled notes furiously. "Do you think they have language?" she asked excitedly. "Maybe we can figure out how they communicate." Her enthusiasm was contagious, but Jake remained wary. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he warned. "We don't know what they're capable of." Despite Jake's concerns, Alan couldn't resist the urge to learn more. He gestured for the team to stay put while he crept closer to the group. Every step felt heavier than the last, adrenaline coursing through his veins. When he was close enough to hear faint grunts and clicks coming from the beings, he stopped, watching intently. One of the creatures noticed him almost immediately. It stood up abruptly, gripping a spear tightly in its hand. Alan raised both palms, in a gesture of peace, hoping to convey that he meant no harm. To his relief, the creature didn't attack. Instead, it tilted its head, studying him with piercing eyes. After a moment, it let out a series of sharp barks, alerting the rest of the group. Within seconds, all activity ceased. Every pair of eyes turned toward Alan, some curious, others cautious. He swallowed hard, realizing just how vulnerable he was. But instead of retreating, he took another step forward, maintaining eye contact with the leader. This time he pointed to himself and said, "Alan," pronouncing his name clearly. The leader blinked once, then mimicked the sound imperfectly. "Alan," it repeated, its voice gravelly but unmistakable. A ripple of murmurs spread through the group, and several of them began repeating the word, experimenting with the syllables. Laura watched from afar, her pen moving rapidly across the page as she documented every detail. Encouraged by their response, Alan tried again, pointing to the leader and raising his eyebrows questioningly. The creature hesitated before tapping its chest and uttering a guttural sound, "Zorak." Alan smiled, nodding enthusiastically. "Zorak," he echoed, earning a low chuckle from the leader. By now, Laura and Jake had joined him, standing a few feet behind. Laura held up her notebook, showing sketches of simple symbols she hoped might spark understanding. Zorak studied them carefully, then grabbed a piece of charcoal lying near the fire. With swift strokes, he drew crude shapes onto a flat rock, mimicking Laura's designs. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but the intent was clear. Jake crossed his arms, still unconvinced. "They're smart. I'll give them that," he admitted reluctantly. "But we need to be careful. We don't know what they're planning." Alan agreed, but couldn't help feeling exhilarated. These beings weren't mindless savages. They were intelligent, resourceful, and eager to interact. Over the next hour, the team exchanged gestures and sounds, building a rudimentary form of communication. By the time night fell, they had established a fragile connection, one built on curiosity rather than fear. As they returned to their campsite, Alan couldn't stop smiling. "This is incredible," he told the others. "We're witnessing the dawn of a new understanding." Jake shook his head, lighting a lantern. "I hope you're right," he said grimly, "because if we underestimate them, it could cost us." His words lingered in the air, casting a shadow over their excitement. Despite their breakthrough, none of them could shake the feeling that there was much more to these beings than met the eye. The next morning, the team woke up with a mix of excitement and caution. The encounter with the Stone Age humans had left them buzzing with questions. Alan couldn't stop thinking about Zorak and the others, their sharp eyes and quick minds, lingering in his thoughts. Laura was equally thrilled, her notebook filled with scribbles and sketches from the previous day. Jake, however, remained quiet, his expression unreadable as he checked their supplies. After breakfast, they decided to return to the clearing where they had met the beings. This time, they brought small gifts, shiny beads, pieces of colored cloth, and a few tools made of metal. They hoped these items would help build trust and encourage further interaction. As they approached the area, they noticed the group was already there, gathered around the same fire. Zorak stood at the center, watching them approach with calm curiosity. Alan stepped forward first, holding out a string of beads. He pointed to himself, then to the gift, mimicking the gesture of giving. Zorak tilted his head, studying the object before accepting it cautiously. He turned it over in his hands, running his fingers along the smooth surface. A murmur of interest rippled through the group as others leaned closer to inspect the beads. One of them reached out, wanting to touch, but Zorak snapped a command, and the hand retreated immediately. Laura smiled, feeling a spark of connection. She knelt down and placed a piece of red cloth on the ground, pushing it gently toward the group. A younger member of the tribe picked it up, examining it closely before tying it around their wrist like a bracelet. Others followed suit, pointing to the remaining gifts and gesturing for more. Alan obliged, distributing the items evenly while maintaining eye contact with Zorak. Jake hung back, observing silently. He noticed how the group moved with precision, each action deliberate and purposeful. When one of them dropped a bead, another quickly retrieved it without being told. There was no shouting or confusion, just seamless cooperation. It was impressive, but it also made him uneasy. These beings weren't acting randomly. They were strategizing, adapting, and learning faster than he expected. As the exchange continued, Laura tried to engage them further. She pointed to her mouth and said, "Laura," repeating her name slowly. Several of the beings mimicked the sound, their attempts rough but understandable. Encouraged, she pointed to one of them, waiting for a response. The individual tapped their chest and replied, "Kara." Laura beamed, jotting down the name in her notebook. She repeated the process with others, collecting names like Tren, Lyra, and Vok. Meanwhile, Alan focused on observing their tools. He picked up a sharpened stone knife, marveling at its craftsmanship. The blade was jagged yet effective, designed for cutting meat or skinning animals. Nearby, another tool caught his eye, a spear with a bone tip attached using some kind of resin. It was crude compared to modern technology, but it worked perfectly for their needs. Alan realized that these beings didn't lack intelligence. They simply used what was available to them. Suddenly, Jake's voice broke the calm. "We need to be careful," he said sharply, stepping closer to Alan and Laura. "They're taking our stuff, sure, but have you noticed how they're copying everything we do?" He gestured toward a corner of the clearing where two of the beings were attempting to mimic the way Jake held his weapon. Their movements were clumsy but unmistakable, as if they were practicing. Alan frowned, glancing at the pair. "It's natural for them to imitate us," he replied. "They're curious, just like we are." But Jake shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Curiosity doesn't explain why they're dismantling our gear when we're not looking," he countered. "Last night I found footprints near our equipment crates. Someone or something was poking around." Laura looked alarmed. "You think it was them?" she asked, lowering her voice. Jake nodded grimly. "Who else? They've been watching us since we got here. I don't think it's just out of curiosity anymore." Before Alan could respond, a commotion erupted in the clearing. One of the younger beings had accidentally knocked over a stack of wooden spears, scattering them across the ground. The group reacted instantly, working together to gather the weapons and reorganize them. What struck Alan most was how efficient they were. No arguments, no hesitation, just coordinated effort. It reminded him of a well-trained military unit. Zorak barked an order, and the group fell silent. He approached Alan, holding up one of the metal tools they had gifted earlier. With deliberate movements, he demonstrated how he intended to use it, carving a groove into a piece of wood. Alan watched in amazement as Zorak adapted the tool to suit his needs, proving that he understood its function beyond mere novelty. Laura whispered to Alan, "They're not just mimicking us. They're improving on what we show them." Alan nodded, his respect for these beings growing by the minute. "This changes everything," he murmured. "If we can teach them, maybe they can teach us too." But Jake wasn't convinced. "Or maybe they're figuring out how to take advantage of us," he muttered under his breath. His skepticism deepened when he spotted one of the beings sneaking toward Laura's backpack. The creature froze when Jake locked eyes with it, then scurried back to the group empty-handed. Jake exhaled sharply, gripping his weapon tighter. "I don't trust them," he said firmly. "Not yet." By late afternoon, the team decided to head back to their campsite. They had gathered enough data for the day, though tensions simmered beneath the surface. As they walked, Laura reviewed her notes aloud, listing names and observations. Alan listened intently, occasionally adding insights of his own. Jake trailed behind, scanning the forest for any signs of movement. When they reached the camp, Jake insisted on setting up additional defenses. He reinforced the perimeter with tripwires and motion sensors, ensuring they would know if anyone or anything approached during the night. Laura rolled her eyes at his paranoia, but Alan supported the idea. Better safe than sorry. he said, patting Jake on the shoulder. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with sounds, rustling leaves, distant howls, and the occasional splash of water. The team sat around their own fire, discussing the day's events. Laura expressed her fascination with the being's ability to learn so quickly. "Imagine what we could achieve if we worked together," she said dreamily. "We could teach them agriculture, medicine, even basic engineering." Jake snorted, shaking his head. "And what happens when they turn those lessons against us?" he challenged. "You saw how fast they figured out our tools. What's stopping them from doing the same with weapons?" Alan sighed, rubbing his temples. "We can't assume the worst," he argued. "Yes, they're intelligent, but that doesn't mean they're hostile. If anything, they've shown restraint. We're the ones barging into their territory." The debate went on for hours, each side presenting valid points. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and they retired to their tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Outside, the forest whispered secrets, and somewhere in the distance, faint footsteps padded softly against the earth. Jake stayed awake, keeping watch, his instincts screaming that the real test was yet to come. The next day started with an unsettling discovery. As the team emerged from their tents, they noticed that several items from their camp were missing. A flashlight, a coil of rope, and even one of Jake's utility knives were gone without a trace. At first, Alan thought it might have been a wild animal rummaging through their supplies, but Jake quickly pointed out the absence of claw marks or scattered debris. Someone, or something, had taken the items deliberately. Laura frowned, flipping through her notebook. "Do you think it was the Stone Age humans?" she asked hesitantly. Jake nodded grimly, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "Who else could it be?" he replied. "They've been watching us since we arrived, and now they're testing us." Alan sighed, torn between curiosity and concern. "Maybe they just wanted to study our tools," he suggested. "It doesn't mean they're planning something." Jake crossed his arms, unconvinced. "You don't sneak into someone's camp and steal their stuff unless you're up to no good," he shot back. "We need to figure out what they're doing before it's too late." Laura bit her lip, unsure who to side with. She admired the being's intelligence but couldn't ignore Jake's warnings. The tension in the air was thick, weighing heavily on all of them. Later that morning, they decided to return to the clearing where they had met Zorak and the others. If the Stone Age humans were responsible for the thefts, confronting them directly seemed like the best option. Armed with patience and Jake's ever-present caution, they made their way through the forest. The journey felt longer than usual, the silence broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of alien birds. When they arrived, the group was already there, gathered around their fire as usual. Zorak stood at the center, his piercing gaze locking on to Alan the moment they entered the clearing. Without hesitation, Alan stepped forward, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. He pointed to himself, then to the missing items, hoping to convey his message clearly. Zorak tilted his head, studying him intently before responding with a series of clicks and grunts. One of the younger beings approached, carrying Jake's stolen knife. It was held out awkwardly, almost as if it were an offering. Jake tensed, gripping his weapon tightly. "What's this supposed to mean?" he muttered under his breath. Alan raised a hand, signaling for calm. "They're returning it," he said softly. "Maybe it was just curiosity after all." But Jake wasn't reassured. "Or maybe they're showing off," he countered, "proving they can take what they want whenever they feel like it." As the day went on, the team observed the group more closely, paying attention to subtle details they had missed before. Laura noticed how the beings communicated not just through sounds, but also through gestures and facial expressions. When one of them pointed to a tree and mimicked climbing, the others immediately understood and began scaling the trunk in search of fruit. Alan marveled at their efficiency, noting how every action served a purpose. Even their play seemed strategic. with younger members practicing hunting techniques while older ones supervised. But Jake remained suspicious. He couldn't shake the feeling that the beings were playing a game, one they didn't fully understand yet. His suspicions grew when he spotted one of them examining a piece of discarded metal foil. The creature turned it over in its hands, studying the reflective surface with keen interest. Then, unexpectedly, it tucked the foil into a pouch slung across its shoulder. Jake narrowed his eyes, wondering what else they might have taken without the team noticing. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere shifted. Zorak called his group together, issuing a series of sharp commands. The beings responded instantly, packing up their belongings and extinguishing the fire. Within minutes, they were ready to move, their movements synchronized and precise. Alan watched in amazement, realizing how organized they truly were. "Look at them," he whispered to Laura. "They're like a well-oiled machine." Laura nodded, scribbling notes furiously. "I wonder where they're going," she mused. "Do you think they migrate, or are they following some kind of schedule?" Before Alan could respond, Zorak approached, pointing toward the forest and making a sweeping motion with his arm. It was clear they were being invited, or perhaps instructed, to follow. Jake hesitated, glancing at Alan. "This feels like a trap," he muttered. "Why would they suddenly lead us somewhere?" Alan shrugged, intrigued despite his unease. "We won't know unless we go," he replied. "Besides, isn't that why we're here? To learn about them?" Reluctantly, Jake agreed, and the team set off behind the group. The journey took them deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the light dimmer. Strange noises echoed around them, low growls and rustling leaves that sent shivers down their spines. Jake stayed alert, his weapon ready, while Laura clutched her notebook tightly, determined not to miss a single detail. After what felt like hours, they reached a massive cave hidden behind a curtain of vines. Zorak gestured for them to wait outside, while several members of the group disappeared inside. Moments later, they returned carrying bundles of food, weapons, and other supplies. It became clear that this was their base, a place where they stored resources and sought shelter. Alan exchanged a glance with Laura, both of them awestruck by the sophistication of their operation. Zorak stepped forward, handing Alan a carved figurine shaped like an animal. It was intricate, with fine details etched into the stone. Alan accepted it gratefully, recognizing it as another form of communication. "Thank you," he said, bowing slightly. Zorak responded with a grunt, though there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. As the sun began to set, the group prepared to leave the cave. Before departing, Zorak pointed to the team and then to the sky, mimicking the motion of a bird taking flight. Alan interpreted it as a farewell gesture, though Jake wasn't convinced. "He's sending us away," Jake muttered. "Either because he trusts us enough to let us go, or because he knows we're no longer useful." Back at their campsite, the team discussed what they had seen. Laura was thrilled by the progress they had made, especially the exchange of gifts and the glimpse into the being's way of life. "They're incredible," she gushed. "So intelligent, so resourceful." Jake scowled, pacing back and forth. "Resourceful doesn't mean trustworthy," he snapped. "They could turn on us in an instant if they thought it would benefit them." Alan sat quietly, lost in thought. He knew Jake had valid concerns, but he couldn't help feeling a deep respect for Zorak and his people. They weren't mindless savages. They were survivors, adapting to their environment with skill and ingenuity. Still, he couldn't deny the unease creeping into his chest. These beings were unpredictable, and their intentions remained unclear. That night, as they settled around the fire, Jake kept watch, his senses on high alert. Every sound, every shadow, made him tense. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being tested, pushed to see how far they would go. Somewhere in the distance, Faint footsteps padded softly against the earth, vanishing as quickly as they came. Jake tightened his grip on his weapon, knowing that the real challenge was only beginning. The following morning brought an eerie calm, the kind that made Jake's skin crawl. The forest seemed quieter than usual, as if it were holding its breath. Alan and Laura noticed it too, but chose to focus on other things. Alan busied himself, examining the carved figurine Zorak had given him, running his fingers over its smooth surface. Laura flipped through her notebook, reviewing sketches and notes from their encounters with the Stone Age humans. Jake, however, remained on edge, pacing around the campsite like a restless animal. By midday, the team decided to return to the clearing where they had first met Zorak and his group. They hoped to continue their interactions, perhaps even establish a deeper connection. As they walked, Jake scanned the trees constantly, his hand never far from his weapon. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he saw no signs of movement in the dense foliage. When they arrived at the clearing, it was empty. The fire had been extinguished, and there was no trace of the beings who had occupied the space just days before. Alan frowned, disappointment creeping into his expression. "Maybe they moved to another location," he suggested, glancing at the surrounding forest. Laura nodded, trying to stay optimistic. "Or maybe they're nearby, waiting to see what we'll do," she added. Jake wasn't convinced. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, kicking at the dirt. "They've been one step ahead of us since we got here." His words hung heavy in the air as the team searched for clues. It didn't take long for them to find something, a series of footprints leading away from the clearing and into the deeper parts of the forest. The tracks were fresh, the soil still damp where the impressions had been made. Alan knelt down to examine them more closely. "These are definitely theirs," he said, pointing to the distinctive shape of the prints. "They must have gone this way." Laura hesitated, glancing nervously at Jake. "Should we follow them?" she asked. Jake sighed, knowing there wasn't much choice. "If we don't, we might lose our chance to understand them," he admitted reluctantly. "But stay alert. Something about this feels off." The trail led them through increasingly dense vegetation, the sunlight barely piercing the thick canopy above. Strange sounds echoed around them, low growls, rustling leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig. Every noise put Jake on edge, his instinct screaming that danger was near. Laura clutched her notebook tightly, trying to stay focused despite her growing unease. Alan forged ahead, determined not to let fear get the better of him. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached a wide, open area surrounded by towering rocks. In the center stood Zorak and several members of his group, their faces unreadable. As they watched the team approach, Alan raised his hands in a gesture of peace, hoping to convey that they meant no harm. Zorak responded by stepping forward, holding up a piece of metal they had gifted earlier. He pointed to it, then to the team, as if asking for an explanation. Laura stepped forward cautiously, opening her notebook to show sketches of tools and symbols. She pointed to the drawings, then to the object in Zorak's hand, attempting to explain its purpose. Zorak studied the images carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. After a moment, he handed the tool to one of his companions, who began experimenting with it, using it to carve markings into a nearby tree. Alan smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "They're learning," he whispered to Laura. "This is exactly what we wanted, to share knowledge." But Jake remained skeptical, his eyes darting around the clearing. He noticed how the group positioned themselves strategically, forming a loose circle around the team. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't entirely welcoming either. "They're boxing us in," he murmured to Alan. "Be ready for anything." As the day wore on, the interactions grew more complex. Zorak demonstrated how his people used teamwork to hunt, mimicking the movements of animals and coordinating attacks with precision. Laura was fascinated, jotting down every detail in her notebook. Alan joined in, showing them how to use basic tools more effectively. He even taught them a simple method for starting fires using friction, which earned approving nods from the group, but Jake couldn't relax. He kept noticing small details, the way the beings exchanged glances, the subtle shifts in their posture, the faint smiles that seemed almost mocking. It was as if they were playing a game, testing the limits of the team's patience and trust. When one of the younger members accidentally dropped a tool, Zorak barked a sharp command, and the item was quickly retrieved. Jake's jaw tightened. "They're disciplined," he muttered under his breath. "Too disciplined." By late afternoon, tensions reached a breaking point. As the team prepared to leave, Zorak blocked their path, gesturing toward the forest, with a firm expression. Alan tried to reason with him, pointing back toward their campsite and explaining that they needed to return. Zorak shook his head, his tone firm and unyielding. For the first time, his demeanor shifted from curious to commanding. Jake stepped forward, his voice low but steady. "We're leaving," he said firmly, meeting Zorak's gaze without flinching. "You can't stop us." Zorak tilted his head, studying Jake closely before issuing a sharp command to his group. Several members moved to block the exit, their expressions neutral but their intentions clear. The message was unmistakable. They weren't letting the team go without a fight. Laura's heart raced as she looked between Jake and Zorak, unsure what to do. Alan raised his hands again, trying to defuse the situation. "There's no need for conflict," he said calmly. "We came here to learn, not to cause trouble." Zorak responded with a series of clicks and grunts, pointing to the tools and supplies scattered around the clearing. It was clear he believed the team owed them something in return for their hospitality. Jake exhaled sharply, gripping his weapon tightly. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "If they want a trade, we'll give them one." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small device, a portable water purifier, and held it up for Zorak to see. The leader's eyes widened slightly, intrigued by the shiny object. Jake placed it on the ground, then gestured for the team to back away slowly. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with tension, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Zorak signaled for his group to stand down, allowing the team to pass. As they walked away, Jake glanced over his shoulder, watching as the beings examined the purifier with keen interest. "That was too close," he muttered. "Next time, they might not let us walk away so easily." Back at the campsite, the team collapsed onto logs around the fire, exhausted but shaken. Laura hugged her notebook to her chest, replaying the events in her mind. "Do you think they'll come after us?" she asked softly. Jake shrugged, lighting a lantern. "Hard to say," he replied. "But I wouldn't be surprised if they do." Alan stared into the flames, his thoughts swirling. He had always believed in the power of communication and mutual understanding, but today's encounter challenged everything he thought he knew. These beings were intelligent, adaptable, and capable of strategy far beyond what he had anticipated. They weren't primitive. They were survivors, just like humans. And now they were proving that they could hold their own against even the most advanced opponents. As night fell, the forest grew darker and quieter, the only sounds coming from distant creatures and the crackling fire. Jake stayed awake, keeping watch while Alan and Laura slept fitfully. Somewhere in the shadows, faint footsteps padded softly against the earth, vanishing as quickly as they came. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. The team had underestimated their hosts, and it might cost them dearly. The next morning brought a sense of urgency to the campsite. The team knew they couldn't stay much longer, not with their supplies dwindling and the Stone Age humans growing bolder by the day. Jake was the first to wake, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. He found none, but the absence of activity made him even more uneasy. "They're planning something," he muttered under his breath as he stirred the ashes of last night's fire. "I can feel it." Alan emerged from his tent moments later, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He glanced at Jake, sensing the tension in his posture. "We need to figure out what they want," Alan said quietly. "If we don't, this situation could spiral out of control." Laura joined them soon after, clutching her notebook tightly. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages, reviewing everything they had learned about Zorak and his people. "Maybe we've been approaching this all wrong," she suggested. "What if they see us as equals instead of outsiders?" Jake snorted, shaking his head. "Equals?" he asked skeptically. "They've been testing us since day one, pushing boundaries and taking what they want. That doesn't sound like treating us as equals." Alan frowned, considering his words. "True, but maybe that's how they establish trust," he replied. "By challenging us, they're learning what we're capable of." Despite their differences, the team agreed on one thing. They needed a plan. Staying put wasn't an option, but neither was leaving without resolving the growing tension. After a quick breakfast of ration bars and water, they decided to return to the clearing where they had last seen Zorak and his group. This time they would bring gifts, tools, food, and other items designed to show goodwill. If nothing else, it might buy them enough time to regroup and decide their next move. As they walked, the forest seemed alive with energy. Birds chirped overhead, and strange insects buzzed around their heads. But beneath the surface calm, there was an undercurrent of unease. Jake kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see figures darting between the trees. When they finally reached the clearing, they found it empty once again. The fire pit was cold, and the ground bore no fresh footprints. For a moment, Alan wondered if they had misjudged the being's intentions entirely. But then, a low whistle cut through the air. The team froze, turning toward the source of the sound. From the edge of the clearing stepped Zorak, flanked by several members of his group. They carried spears tipped with sharpened bone, their expressions unreadable as they approached. Alan raised his hand slowly, signaling peace. He knelt down and placed the gifts carefully on the ground before stepping back. Zorak studied the offerings intently, his sharp eyes flickering between the items and the team. For several long moments, no one moved. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Zorak gestured for one of his companions to inspect the gifts. The younger member picked up a small knife, examining it closely before handing it off to another. This process repeated until every item had been scrutinized. Satisfied, Zorak nodded and issued a command. Several members of the group began gathering, the gifts carrying them back toward the forest. Jake exhaled sharply, lowering his weapon slightly. "That's it?" he asked, disbelief coloring his tone. "They just take our stuff and walk away?" Alan shook his head, watching Zorak closely. "No," he said softly. "Look at him. He's waiting for something." Sure enough, Zorak remained in the clearing, his gaze fixed firmly on the team. It was clear he wasn't done with them yet. Laura took a hesitant step forward, holding up her notebook. She pointed to the sketches inside, then to herself and the team. Zorak tilted his head, studying her curiously before responding with a series of clicks and grunts. Laura smiled nervously, mimicking the sounds as best she could. To her surprise, Zorak chuckled, a deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the clearing. Encouraged, she continued, pointing to the tools and making gestures to suggest cooperation. Alan joined in, demonstrating how to use the items they had gifted. He showed them how to set snares for hunting and how to purify water using the device Jake had traded earlier. Zorak watched intently, occasionally issuing commands to his group. Within minutes, the beings were experimenting with the tools, adapting them to suit their needs. One of them used the knife to carve intricate patterns into a piece of wood. while another practiced setting traps with surprising skill. Jake hung back, still wary but unable to deny the progress being made. "They're learning faster than I expected," he admitted reluctantly. "It's almost like they already know what to do. They're just refining their techniques." Alan nodded, pride swelling in his chest. "Exactly," he said. "They're not primitive. They're resourceful. All they needed was a little guidance." As the day wore on, the interactions grew more collaborative. The team worked alongside Zorak's group, teaching them new skills while observing their methods in return. Laura marveled at their ability to communicate without words, relying on gestures and context to convey meaning. Alan was impressed by their adaptability, noting how quickly they incorporated new knowledge into their daily routines. Even Jake began to soften, recognizing the mutual benefit of their partnership. By late afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a tense standoff had evolved into something resembling cooperation. Zorak signaled for the group to gather around, issuing a series of commands that sent them scattering to collect materials. Moments later, they returned, carrying bundles of food and supplies. These were offered to the team as a gesture of gratitude, though Jake eyed them suspiciously. "This feels too easy," he muttered. "Why are they suddenly being so generous?" Alan shrugged, accepting the gifts graciously. "Maybe they understand now that we're not a threat," he suggested. "Or maybe they're showing us they can give as much as they take." Laura nodded, smiling faintly. "Either way, it's a step forward," she added. "We've built a bridge, even if it's fragile." As the sun began to set, Zorak approached the team one final time. He held up a carved figurine similar to the one he had given Alan earlier, pointing to it and then to the sky. The message was clear. They were free to leave, but the connection between them would remain. Alan bowed slightly, expressing his thanks. Zorak responded with a nod, his expression unreadable but not unkind. The journey back to the campsite was quiet. Each member of the team lost in thought. Laura clutched her notebook tightly, reflecting on everything they had learned. "They're incredible," she whispered. "So intelligent, so adaptable." Jake sighed, shaking his head. "Yeah, but don't forget, they're also dangerous," he reminded her. "We got lucky this time, but we can't afford to underestimate them again." Alan stared ahead, his mind racing. He had come to Kepler 62F expecting to study primitive life forms, but what he found was far more complex. These beings weren't relics of the past. They were mirrors of humanity itself, shaped by survival and driven by curiosity. As they packed up their gear and prepared to depart, Alan felt a pang of regret. Leaving felt like saying goodbye to old friends, even though their relationship had been brief. When the team finally boarded their shuttle and lifted off, they looked down at the planet below. The forests stretched endlessly, hiding countless secrets within their depths. Somewhere down there, Zorak and his people continued their lives, unchanged by the encounter, but perhaps wiser for it. Alan leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes, as the ship soared toward the stars. "We came here thinking we were superior," he murmured. "But in truth, we were the ones who needed to evolve." Jake didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Laura smiled faintly, flipping through her notes one last time. Despite everything, they had achieved something remarkable, a fragile alliance built on mutual respect. And as the shuttle disappeared into the vastness of space, the memory of Zorak and his people lingered, a reminder that intelligence takes many forms and that understanding begins with humility.